have to come up and give a speech, you know that. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I certainly appreciate it. It looks like a wonderful audience. And the first speech I gave about the Buzzards was in this very chapel, and that was 13 years ago. And the vice president of the Historic Society, or vice president, Mitch Dissinger, I'm not sure, I think, oh, there he is. He said to me, he's like, I heard you do research on the Buzzards. And I said, I do. And he said, would you like to give a speech for the Historic Society? And I said, yeah, I can do that. And he said, do you get nervous talking in front of people? And I said, I don't think so. I said, how many people are going to show up? And he said, well, we usually get about 30 or so, but with this, there might be about 50 or 60. Well, over 330 showed up. I stopped counting at 3:30, so then I was a little nervous. But they say if you know your subject, you have nothing to be nervous about. So my information, as Jan said, I grew up here in New Holland, born after the hospital, grew up in New Holland, graduated from Garden Spot High School, went in the Marine Corps after high school, and then traveled all over the world. That was exciting. And then went to the Reading Police Academy and became a police officer here in New Holland for the last 27 years. So I have about a year to go, a year and a half. So how I became interested in the Buzzard Gang. When I was a little kid, like a lot of people, little boys, they're interested in cowboys and Indians of the Wild West. And that kind of moved on to outlaws of the Wild West, Jesse James and Billy the Kid and the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And then my mother said, well, you know, there's an outlaw that used to live here in Lancaster County, or up in the Welsh Mountains. And as a little kid, we lived on the outskirts of the Welsh Mountains. And then that was it. I was hooked. I wanted to, having a love of local history, I wanted to learn everything about the Buzzards. And that started at a pretty young age. I was probably about 10, 11, 12. So it's been about 40 years now that I've been doing research on the Buzzards. So there are absolutely two things that I hate when it comes to discussing the Buzzard Gang or the Buzzard Brothers. One is whenever you read anything in the local paper or whenever anybody writes anything about the Buzzards, they always talk about them being petty criminals and petty thieves and a bunch of chicken thieves. Well, the Buzzards did a lot worse than that. And that's what we're going to get to. So if I stood up here and talked about some chickens that were stolen from a farm, that wouldn't be very interested. So I am going to discuss some things very briefly, some things in more detail about the serious crimes that they committed and the big things that they've done in their lives. The other thing I want to talk about is the Buzzard descendants today. They are wonderful people. They should not be looked down upon or reflected poorly from the gang from the 1800s, this group of brothers. The Buzzards are wonderful people. Bob Buzzard was a roadmaster here in New Holland. He loved researching. We talked back and forth about the Buzzards, the Buzzard Gang. And I met quite a few descendants, and they're wonderful people. They should not be looked down upon. So I wanted to make that known. So this is my, I think, 15th speech in the last 13 years. I spoke to over 1,000 people. I have a video on YouTube that has about 3,000 views. And I love talking about them and educating people about the Buzzards. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started. The Welsh Mountains. Is there anybody here that does not know where the Welsh Mountains is? Anybody? If you don't know, don't be scared. Raise your hand. Okay. The Welsh Mountains, about 1,000 feet above sea level, roughly about 40 square miles, give or take some. The most western part of the Welsh Mountains is out at Hollander Road. It's technically part of the Welsh Mountains, even though most people that come from the Welsh Mountains wouldn't say that little mountain range from Hollander Road up through Tabor Road, up into Summitville Road and Hymes's Hill. Even though it's technically part of the Welsh Mountains, most people probably wouldn't really consider that. That is the outskirts. But the real western part of the Welsh Mountains is probably out where Redwell Road is. So it was 1,000 feet above sea level. Back many years, it was Native Americans that lived there. In the colonial days, when Europeans came over, it was first settled by Welsh people from Wales. They bought land from William Penn, and they started making their way to the Welsh Mountains, or they lived in the Welsh Mountains among some of the Native Americans. I don't know how much they interacted, but they lived up there with the Native Americans. Shortly after that, then the blacks, African Americans started coming up, escaped slaves from the South, started working their way. They come across the Mason-Dixon line, and that's one of the first places they stopped. The Welsh Mountains, with the African Americans, they felt it was a place that they could also escape because it was hard for slave owners from the South to come find them because they could hide out in the mountainous area. After a while, it was really a melting pot where the Indians and the African Americans started having families. They claimed there were black Indians up there at one point. And it was really an area where the whites and the blacks, it was really a melting pot, one of the earlier melting pots of this area. Down in the small villages and the towns, it wasn't, people didn't, there was a lot more segregation. But in the Welsh Mountains, they all seemed to get along. They all seemed to interact with each other, and there was interracial families, and they all seemed to get along. It was really a melting pot in the early years in this area. Now, the Welsh Mountains, as some of you might know, was an extremely poor area back in those days. From the 1800s all the way even up into the 1960s. Our own Lancaster newspaper in the 1960s said the Welsh Mountains was and their quote was, the slummiest area of all Lancaster County. As a kid, I remember going up there, and even in the 80s, seeing a lot of shacks, people living out of buses, doors off the buses, animals running in and out. People even up into the 80s didn't have, some of the houses up there didn't have running water. They still got their water from a spring or a store in later years. Early years, it was a spring. They didn't have showers, very poor conditions. And as some of you might know, when Lyndon Johnson became president in the 60s, one of his big pushes was social reform. We're getting people up to a better standard of living. Lancaster County assigned a caseworker to handle just the Welsh Mountains itself. Our own Lancaster newspaper, as I said earlier, even described the Welsh Mountains as the poor people, the uneducated people, the interracial people, and even our own Lancaster paper back in the 1800s talked bad about it. At one time, nobody wanted to go into the Welsh Mountains. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's the Welsh Mountains, about 40 square miles. Right here is really at Hollander Road. This is Himes Hill area right here. But for most of the mountain, it goes all the way into Chester County, and it back in the 1800s, a lot of shacks, a lot of poor conditions. Oops, sorry. People living in the worst conditions. No, some of these pictures didn't get out. So the name Buzzard, it has French origins. Some people pronounced it different. Some people called it Buzzard or Bowsard. It was spelled different, like a lot of names. Some people spelled it B-O-Z-Z-A-R-D. Some people spelled it with S's, B-O-S-S-A-R-D. But for this particular family, they called themselves Buzzards, just like the bird, and they spelled it B-U-Z-Z-A-R-D. Now, you can probably find buzzards in every state in our country. And they weren't just subject to the Welsh Mountains. You can find buzzards long before this family, obviously. In Montgomery County, there's a lot in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. Chester County, Montgomery County, so forth. The father was John Buzzard. And John was from Laycock Township, and he married a lady by the name of Mary Ann Glauner. Some people will spell it Clowners, C-L-O-W-N-E-R, but she spells it, and it was actually spelled G-L-A-U-N-E-R. She was from East Earl Township. He was from Laycock Township. They got married at the Trinity Lutheran Church, and they settled in the Welsh Mountains. John was killed, enlisted in the Civil War, and he was killed in 1862. And that obviously caused the mother to raise all her children after he passed away. They had 6 sons and 2 daughters. Now, I will admit I do not know a lot about the daughters. But as far as the 6 sons, the oldest was Martin, John, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. You know, I used to talk about that all the time, and everybody would laugh, and I said, why is everybody laughing about that? And then it dawned on me why. So as far as John, he committed a few crimes early on when he was young, late teens and early 20s, some petty crimes, stealing chickens and stuff like that, stealing things from neighbors. But he joined the Mennonite church, and he pretty much went quiet. You don't hear much about him after that. Jacob, he died at the age of 33. So that means the other 4 sons, Martin, Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, they were the ones that really became the big criminals and the ones that really have the big names. As I said, John, he died in the Civil War. Oh, that's Abraham, a young picture of Abraham. It's a younger picture of Isaac and Joseph. I wish I had a picture of Martin. I'm still looking for it, but I don't have one. Now, John died in the Civil War, the father, in 1862, and he was brought up here to the Mount Airy Evangelical Church, and he was buried at the Mount Airy Evangelical Church. And as I said, that caused the mother to raise all her sons by herself. Some of the children back then were sent to Paradise Soldier Orphan School. Apparently back then in those days, after the Civil War, Pennsylvania was one of the first states to create orphan schools for the children. They were first sent to the Paradise Orphan School. Then that was in operation for a few years. Then they sent them to the Mount Joy Soldier Orphan School. This is on Barbara Street. That's a picture of it. That's a picture of it there on Barbara Street in Mount Joy. This is a picture of it today. There it is, back in the 1800s. There it is today. It's an apartment complex. Now, you would think that these criminals, they turned to a life of crime, the brothers, the 4 remaining brothers, but it wasn't them that committed the first crime. And it wasn't the father that committed the first crime. It was the mother. Mary Buzzard worked for a guy by the name of Elmaker, and she stole food from him one day, probably to feed her family. And Mary ends up getting sentenced to 6 months for stealing apple butter, sausage, and butter and lard. 6 months. I think some criminals today might learn a lesson if they did 6 months for some crimes, but shortly thereafter, Abraham and his brother Jacob stole from a store up in the Welsh Mountains. Abraham at the time was 14, and his brother Jacob was 10. They were both sentenced to Lancaster County Prison. Abraham for 10 days, his 10-year-old brother Jacob for 10 hours. Back then, apparently, they didn't have juvenile hall or the old Barnes Hall. They put him right in the Lancaster County Prison. So as the boys started getting older, they did commit some petty crimes. It was mostly breaking into people's houses, stealing chickens. They would steal chickens from neighbors, take it to a market and sell the chickens. And it was pretty much petty crimes until the late to the mid-1870s. Ike and Abe, by this time they're in their late teens, early 20s, they got drunk by stealing a keg of whiskey, and they showed up at church on Sunday morning under the influence. They met a guy by the name of Tom Axe and James Palmer. I'm sorry. And it was at this church right here. The same church that their father was buried at. I met with the pastor a couple weeks ago, and we were trying to figure out if this Mr. Axe and Palmer was the pastor, because it is reported that they started a riot and they broke the pastor's arm. And we thought, well, maybe it wasn't at this particular church, but then I did later find that it was at this church. He talks about it was the same church that his father died at. Now, it's one thing that's hard to talk about the Buzzard Gang is because of quite their age. They committed crimes from the late 1860s all the way up into the early 1940s. The oldest, Martin, is 21 years older than the youngest son, brother Joseph. So it's a little bit hard to talk about their whole legacy. They were constantly committing crimes. Sometimes they were together, sometimes they were independent, and sometimes they were doing it with gang members. During the early years, there was quite a few gang members in with the Buzzard brothers. And they had a gang of about 20 people, most of them Welsh Mountain people, some from Ephrata, some from Lancaster City. But here's Dave Halk. He was a popular figure with the group, John Boots. And as you can see, there were black and white members of the Welsh Mountain that were in their gang. There wasn't as much racial problems with this particular family because they all grew up in the Welsh, they all lived together. So in 1875, one of the first big crimes was Ike Buzzard going up to northern Lebanon, and he broke into an iron ore factory, and he was able to steal $1,000. He missed $900. They then came down to Bird-in-Hand Railroad Station, and they broke in here. This is at the Bird-in-Hand Railroad Station. And they were able to steal $6 and some whiskey from there. I don't know why the railroad station had whiskey, but they did that. And then they moved on to this place. This is in Shennick. Ike Buzzard, Abe, and another gang member went into this building right here. They went in through the basement. They were able to come up to the cash register. They took the $6 out of the till, and they also stole some whiskey. Ike Buzzard, coming out of the hotel, was shot by a neighbor across the street, shot in the back of the head. It must not have been too bad of an injury because he survived. He later went on, but that's going to play some important factors later in his life. But he was shot in the back of the head, and his co-conspirator was shot in the eyes and lost his eyesight. But they were able to make their way from this location. Oh, this is the hotel in Shennick. Later years, they added a second floor and then onto a third floor. And this still stands there in Shennick today. They're at the square. In 1880, Abe and Ike went down to Oxford, Pennsylvania in southern Chester County, and they broke into this place right here. It is a coal and lumber yard where they heard that there was a lot of money and a safe was in this lumber yard in the office, and they broke in and they got 50 cents for it. After that, they went around the town and they broke into a jewelry store, a jewelry shop. This one right here, Erie Barton's jewelry store, where they stole 23 silver watches and 8 gold watches. From there, they moved on to Georgetown, which is in Bart Township, Lancaster County, the southern end, the little village of Georgetown, and they broke into this place. This is Benjamin Fritz's store. While they were breaking in here, they broke in here, and they also broke into this place here. This was a guy by the name of Free, F-E-R-R-E-E. This was a store that he also had in Bart, in Georgia. So while they were breaking in here, A horse and buggy came around the corner, saw them, and they had to quickly get out of there. The guy on the horse and buggy, he started sounding the alarm to the town, started shouting that there was a robbery or a burglary. Abe and Ike Buzzard jumped on some horses that they stole close by, and they started making their way to the Welsh Mountains. It was reported that a posse formed right there in the little village of Georgetown and started chasing them and started shooting at them as they made their way from Georgetown all the way to the edge of the Welsh Mountains before the posse gave up. The Buzzards would often get to the Welsh Mountains, and they would hide out at a place right here. It's called the Blue Rocks. The Buzzards themselves named it the Blue Rocks or the Blue Caves. This here is off the 200 block of Redwell Road, up in the mountain. And Abe said the electric lights of Lancaster could be seen from the Blue Rocks or the Blue Caves when they would stay there at nighttime. The Blue Rocks or the Blue Caves, it's about 50 yards by 100 yards wide, a big group of rocks that do, when the sun hits them, have a bluish tint to it. So I guess that's why they called them. But Abe and Ike, they were able to dig a cave down under the Blue Rocks and move a boulder in front of the entranceway, and they would be able to hide out. And they talk a lot about how they had escaped to the Blue Rocks. Sometimes they lived there at night, slept in this cave overnight. Sometimes they said that by hiding out in the Blue Rocks, they could watch the posses that formed to come get them. And they'd move all around the valley, move all around the mountain. They could be hiding in there. Now, it was reported to me that the Blue Rocks, the cave part of it, actually crashed in the 1930s. But it's still a big rock formation, but the cave's no longer there. Some reports said that people went up there with dynamite in the 1930s and blew it up intentionally so it couldn't be used ever again, or that wasn't a danger to kids that were playing around it. Some people said it just fell in, and it's still up there. It's an interesting piece of history because they talk so many times about how the gang would escape to the Blue Rocks. Here's another part of it. Now, Abe talked about the Blue Rocks a lot. And he even said that the Blue Rocks were positioned about a half a mile above what they called back in those days Lousetown. Lousetown was not an official name for the village or this cluster of houses. It was their own kind of local name, not just Abe, but a lot of people around here. And Lousetown is on Redwell Road, the 200 block, in between Lowry Road and the Groff Creek. If you remember, if anybody remembers that area, Frank Peters had a garage out there. There was an auto mechanic, I think, by the name of Shirk that lived out there. I think his name was Shirk. But that was where they called Lousetown. Up at Mount Airy, where their father died, that was known as Scrufftown. Just local names, it wasn't an official name. And the Mount Airy, where the father died, that's the Mount Airy in the Welsh Mountains, not to be confused with the Mount Airy in Clay Township, but it was the Mount Airy up in the Welsh Mountains. So you had Scrufftown, you had Lousetown, and because there's some children in here, there was another name of a village around here, starts with a B, ends with a CH, and that was known as Town, and that was out there on South Custer Avenue near Summit View Road, and that was widely known as B-Town. The Lancaster County Prison, built in 1852. Back then, the walls were shorter, about 20 foot high, no barbed wire, and this, less guards. Well, on October 10th of 1883, well, let me back up a little bit. Less guards, 20 foot walls, no barbed wire. Today, the prison has about 350 people working. About 300 correction officers, about 25 counselors, and about 25 roughly medical personnel. Walls are bigger, barbed wire, and towers to watch anybody trying to escape. But in October 10th, 1883, There has been numerous prison breaks prior to that, but Abe and Ike Buzzard orchestrated the largest prison break in Lancaster County history. Now, I used to talk about that a lot, largest prison break, and then I found out in the 1880s there was also another one that would tied it for the same amount of prisoners that escaped, 1980s. But in October of 1883, there was a boxing match that was taking place in Lancaster City between a guy by the name of Sullivan and another guy by the name of Slade. And apparently it had attracted a lot of attention, and a lot of the prison guards wanted to go see this boxing match. And that left only 2 prison guards to manage the prison at that time. Now, there wasn't as many inmates as there are today. Back then, there was less than 100 inmates. Today, there's about anywhere between 800 to 1,300 inmates in the Lancaster County Prison, about 100 women at any one time. But back then, there was only about 60, 70 prisoners in the prison. So the prison guards went to watch this boxing match, and that led the prison to be mostly unguarded. Well, Ike Buzzard was allowed to have a bird or a canary that he raised in the prison. Why, I don't know. You heard about the Birdman of Alcatraz. Well, I guess Ike Buzzard was the Birdman of Lancaster County Prison. So he was allowed to have a canary or a bird that he raised in his jail cell. Well, this bird laid eggs and had chicks, and they found that if they separate the chicks, the mother would fly back and forth to them, and they realized this is a good way to communicate between the different jail cells. So Abe and Ike would tie notes to the mom, and she would fly back and forth to them. Well, they orchestrated this prison break, where at that night, Ike Buzzard asked one of the prison guards if he could send the bird or some chicks over to his brother's cage. And when he opened up his jail cell, he grabbed the prison guard, threw him in the jail cell, stole his keys, and they started opening up the different jail cells. 12 different people escaped that night. And they started grabbing clubs and keys and firearms from the prison, and they made their way out of prison, 12 people that escaped. And they came along to the courtyard of the prison, and there was one prison guard left, which was a dog. Named Bruno. Bruno started sounding the alarm that people were escaping. And they took their clubs and they beat Bruno. And eventually, 2 weeks later, he passed away. 12 different prisoners escaped. The one brother, Joe Buzzard, he only had a few weeks left on his sentence, or a month left on his sentence, and they said, "You stay behind, we don't want you to escape and get more time on your sentence." So after that, the Buzzards, they making their way back to the Welsh Mountains, they reorganize their gang, and they start going on a crime spree between 1880 to 1883, or I'm sorry, 1883 and 1884. They start breaking into places all over the area. They start committing a lot of burglaries. One of the places was James Heitler's Cigar Factory in Rossville, Isaac Brineseller's store in Rossville, the Millway Meeting House in Clay Township, the Wabash Elementary School in Ephrata, this place, the Lincoln Elementary School in Earl Township, Steinmetz Meeting House, that's up in Shennick, Geist Store in Schwartzville, Geiger Store in Quarryville, that's there in the 1800s. This is here in modern days. The old Watney's restaurant in Clay Township. This was known as Steinmetz store. They broke into there. And Metzler's store, Main Street, Ephrata. That's where it looked like in the 1800s. That's where it is today. And the Ephrata Railroad Station. Oh, I'm sorry. The Ephrata Railroad Station. And that was the Hershey Mill and Lehman Place. Lehman Place being right down on Route 30. The Ephrata Railroad Station. This gentleman here, his name is Allison Bollinger Hollinger. They called him A.B. Hollinger. And A.B., this is an older picture of him when he was in the Civil War, but he wasn't this old looking at the time. He owned the store right here, Hollinger's store. That is in Lincoln, Pennsylvania. This is what it looks like today. It's right across from the Lincoln House restaurant, Book Organs. But back then, in November 9th of 1883, Abe Buzzard and his co-conspirator named John Clifford broke into here. And they stole a lot of clothing and they stole a lot of money, about $1,000 worth of money. They went out into the fields close by where they tried to hide out. Well, the next day, Mr. Hollinger, I'm sorry, I'm new at this clicker thing. Mr. Hollinger finds out about his store being broken into and he forms a posse to go out looking for these people. Now, I'm not sure if these were the people, but this was the Lincoln Sportsman's Club, a firearm sportsman's club of Lincoln at the day. And I assume that some of these people were part of the posse that went out looking for him. This man here in particular, of all these men here, of course the guy that I want the picture of is this guy right up here. That kind of got whited out. He was friends with Hollinger. And they went out searching for him, found him in a field, Joe Clifford and Abe Buzzard, a couple miles away. And they called for him to halt or to stop. Abe Buzzard and Joe Clifford started firing on the posse, started shooting at him. And the newspaper reports that a 2-mile run-and-gun battle took place from the village of Lincoln all the way to the Ephrata Mountain. They would reload their guns and they would fire at each other. The posse would be firing at Abe and John Clifford. They made their way to the edge of the Ephrata Mountain, and John Clifford gets shot in the leg, and he goes down, and he's exhausted. He says, I can't go any farther. I'm done. Abe Buzzard himself gets shot in the side, but he's still on his feet. He still managed to run and get away. He loads his gun. He aims back at the posse one last time, and he fires 6 shots. He shoots this man right here, Ellis Bard. Now, if you look at this picture was taken a couple years after the shootout. Now, I'm not sure if it's just the way the photo shows, but you can see right here where his jaw is kind of disformed here. And it looks a little bit more rounded on this side, and these 2 black here. I'm not sure if that's just the picture or if that's an injury, but Ellis Bard gets shot in the face. The newspaper reports that 2 teeth get knocked out. He also gets shot in the chest, but he does live. And this causes a big stir in Ephrata. People are out looking for the Buzzards. They're looking for this person. Ellis eventually recovers. And the next day, the county commissioners in Lancaster put out a $1,000 dead or alive warrant for Abe Buzzard because of this incident and all the break-ins that he was involved in. Abe is on the hill, on the Ephrata Mountain, and he's running around the Ephrata Mountain. An interesting fact is, after Abe gets arrested, this gentleman here, this Ellis Bard, he himself is a banker in Lincoln, and later on in life, he gets convicted of some type of bank fraud, and he's sent down to Eastern State Penitentiary, just where Abe Buzzard has to be at. Abe later gets arrested and is down at Eastern State. So they serve time together, but he eventually heals up. Now, because of the shooting, this police officer, this detective, a guy by the name of Bartholomew from Philadelphia, comes out to Lancaster County, and he starts looking for Abe Buzzard on the Ephrata Mountain. Not does he doesn't just look for him, but he is able to become friends with some of the gang members, and he infiltrates the gang, and he goes along with them on different burglaries that they're committing. And he keeps a detailed diary of what he's doing, and he's reporting his findings back to the local authorities. Later, this Bartholomew, when it comes time to arrest Abe Buzzard, he finds him on the Ephrata Mountain, and another shootout takes place. Abe is already injured from the shootout in Lincoln, but he gets wounded again. Detective Bartholomew does not get shot, but Abe again is able to escape. Abe and his wife, who was part who received some of the items from the burglaries in recent months, was also arrested, along with some other gang members. In November 29th of 1884, there was a big robbery that took place in Bowmansville. And for many years, it was called the Great Robbery. The people of Bowmansville often described it while talking to each other, saying, did it happen before the robbery or after the robbery? So that's how they kind of kept track of time. But it was a guy by the name of D.B. Schiffer. He owned this jewelry store. Owned this jewelry store right here. That might be D.B. himself, I'm not sure. But he owned his jewelry store, and Abe Buzzard broke in there one night. Him and his, Abe and Ike and his co-conspirators broke in there, and they stole $900, 30 new watches, and 22 used watches. Now, back in those days, law enforcement wasn't what it is today. And especially here in Lancaster County, law enforcement, they didn't have local police a lot of the times. You would usually require the local constable or the sheriff in Lancaster to come out to investigate crimes. And they didn't have laws the way they do today. And little villages and towns all over Lancaster County would kind of create their own little detective agencies. And they would go out without any training, and they would investigate crimes. And some of these detective agencies lasted all the way up until the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s. And they had treasurers, and they had secretaries and presidents, and they would raise funds. But they would go out and they would investigate crimes themselves. And one of them, the Goodville Horse Detective Agency, investigated this particular crime, and they found the safe the night after the burglary. They found the safe. This is D.B. Schiffer's jewelry store back in the 1800s. This is it today. It's still in Bowmansville. It's an apartment complex. D.B. Schiffer himself put wanted posters all throughout the area. He hired a cameraman, and he created his own wanted poster, which I have a copy of an original one right here. And they started searching all over the place. More than 200 people formed to search this. They went all through the Welsh Mountains, taking pictures of some of the shacks and the places that Abe would visit and some of the gang members' families. And they were all through the Welsh Mountains. And a few days later, one of the gang members, a guy by the name of Lippincott, George Lippincott, he took the watches, went over to Columbia to jump on a train to go up to Harrisburg to pawn them. And Lippincott himself got stopped. He pulls out a gun. He's trying to shoot at the railroad detectives or the railroad police that stopped him. They were able to grab him, and they found out these watches were part of the burglary from Bowmansville. George Lippincott was a known Buzzard Gang associate, and him and Abe got arrested for this crime when he confessed that they were the ones that broke in. Where were they sent? They were sent here, Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia. It was one of the first times that the Buzzards started really going down to Eastern State for all their crimes. They were usually, when convicted, they would spend time in the Lancaster prison. Here they were sent to Eastern State Penitentiary. About the same time that Abe was arrested, Ike was arrested walking down Main Street, Ephrata. A few years after that, in 1893, Abe Buzzard himself was given a pardon by the state, and this is his governor pardon by the state. Abe gets out in 1893, comes back to the Welsh Mountains, and starts committing crimes again. Now, this is one of the bigger crimes that the Buzzards committed. That's Abe getting out of prison, out of Eastern State Penitentiary. This house, it stands on the corner of South Groffdale Road and Main Street, Groffdale, Route 23 and South Groffdale Road. The house still stands today. This was the house of a guy by the name of Isaiah Schaefer. Isaiah Schaefer was 85 years old. And in October of 1893, Martin Buzzard and a guy by the name of Joseph Brownsweger heard that Isaiah Schaefer was a rich farmer and that he had a lot of money in his house. So Martin Buzzard and Brownsweger came up with a plan that they were going to rob him. The newspaper states that they went in through a window in the back near the porch, and as they got into the house, they started looking around to find out where the money is. They were able to take $60 out of a drawer, and they expected a lot more money in there, but they only found $60. Somewhere during the night, a maid who lived on the second floor, she hears them downstairs, and she sounds the alarm. She starts walking down, and they confront each other. She screams, locks herself upstairs, and by this time, Isaiah Schaefer, who was living on the bottom floor, he gets awakened. Now, October of 1893, probably no electricity in the house, probably pretty cold. The only light was probably from a wood stove or a lantern or a candle. And Isaiah Schaefer, being 85 years old, sees these people in his house, and he grabs a fire poker from the fireplace. And he starts swinging it at them. Now, let's just imagine this. 85 years old, probably had a frail voice, probably said something like, "Get out of here. There's nothing here for you. Leave me alone." And he was trying to get these people at 85 years old out of his house. Martin Buzzard pulls out a gun, and he points it at Isaiah Schaefer. And he shoots him in the head. Petty criminals, right? Well, Isaiah Schaefer must have been a pretty tough old farmer because he didn't die. Dr. Leslie from Leola, assisted with a doctor from Lancaster, were able to save his life. They removed the bullet. Martin Buzzard and Brownsweger jump out the window. They work their way east on Main Street. They get to Peters Road, and they start heading towards the Welsh Mountains. A guy by the name of John Curley, who happened to be up at night, recognized them as they went by. John Curley said the horse had a limp to it or some type of an injury, and they were able to trace the next day, this type of stride or this injured horse along with the hooves that it was wearing from Isaiah Schaefer back to Martin Buzzard's house. Now, Martin said, "It wasn't me. It was my brother Abe that was there." But based on John Curley's witness, said, "No, I seen them too." Said it was Martin. Where this caused a big kind of stir where they were pointing fingers at each other for a few months. Abe said it wasn't me, it was Martin. Martin said it wasn't me, it was Abe. And Martin Buzzard later gets convicted, sentenced to 16 years in prison at Eastern State Penitentiary. Isaiah Schaefer dies 5 years later and is buried out at Zeltenreich Church at the age of 90. Martin Buzzard and Brownsweger are convicted. They go down to Eastern State Penitentiary. This is Martin Buzzard's booking sheet. And this is Brownsweger's booking sheet. I'm still trying to find pictures of Martin. I'm hoping to do that someday. All this over $60 of money. Abe Buzzard is out on the run at this time. He wasn't convicted of the Schaefer burglary. That was Martin. And he starts committing some crimes himself. When Abe would get released from the penitentiary, he would often talk about being a changed man and finding God and religion. And it was known that Abe started preaching the Bible. He was going around to different villages, different churches, different hotels preaching, and he was getting a pretty good following. People would come to listen preach, saying how he's a reformed outlaw, he doesn't commit crimes anymore. But they quickly realized that they found that all of a sudden with these churches, some of the Bibles start getting stolen. And they found that Abe was signing them and autographing them and handing them out and stealing the Bibles. But in 1894, Abe was convicted of burglarizing this place. This was the Miller store in Adamstown. I later found out somehow that I'm connected. My family owned this store at one time, or hotel back in Adamstown years ago. And he also broke into this place, Cohen's store in Main Street, Ephrata, which looks like this today. He broke into the Fields Hotel down in Christiana. And he also broke into this place, Graff's Hotel in Shortsville, up on 272, across from Weaver grocery store. When Abe was breaking into this place, he was doing it with his son, Jake Buzzard, and another gang member. A guy by the name of Balmer was showing up to work one morning and found them on the side. When I took this picture, it just so happened it looks like there's a police car over here. But that wasn't planned. But when Mr. Balmer was trying to break into the store, when Abe was breaking into the store and Mr. Balmer showed up, Mr. Balmer interrupted the burglary, and Abe pulls out a gun, points it at Mr. Balmer, threatens to kill him if he moves, and starts shooting. He didn't shoot him, he missed, but he fired 3 shots before they ran away. Abe was later convicted of these 4 burglaries and sentenced to Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, Abe and Joe and Ike were in and out of prison quite a few times in the 1890s, the teens, the 1900s, and the 1920s. And it's kind of hard to follow their timeline because, as I said earlier, they're in and out of prison so many times that there's big gaps where they weren't committing crimes, obviously, because they're in prison. And this is when they were getting older in their life. And they started committing more petty crimes again. They weren't breaking into houses. They weren't holding people up at gunpoint. They weren't breaking into businesses anymore. They started doing a lot of more petty crimes, stealing chickens, stealing from their neighbors, stuff like that. In September of 1926, Abe is out of prison and goes up to a farm in the Welsh Mountains. A guy by the name of William Spots. Oh, that's Abe. I'm sorry, that's Abe later in his life. He goes up to the Welsh Mountains and he commits some theft of chickens. William Spots hears him outside one night and grabs a shotgun and 3 shells, and he walks up very close to Abe, puts his gun up, and fires. But the gun jammed. So he pulls the shell out of the gun, puts another shell in it. Abe sees this, obviously. He starts taking off running, and William Spots fires and shoots him in the shoulder. A week later, or a couple days later, Abe is picked up by the Phoenixville police, and while he's in their custody, they asked him to remove his shirt. He removes his shirt, and they find all the bullet holes in him, and they arrest him for the Spots attempted theft. Now, by this time, Abe is a obviously he's a habitual criminal, and because of him constantly breaking the law, the judge finally gives him a pretty lengthy prison sentence, and it was the last time that Abe was out of prison. Now, by this time, Joe himself is getting older. He's in his 70s. This is the 1930s. And Joe is here in New Holland, and he starts for about 4 or 5 weeks. He starts stealing a lot of horses and buggies from the area. Joe goes down to South Railroad Avenue one day, steals a horse and buggy, and starts making his way to Coatesville, where he has a guy that he's selling these to. He said he was watching this horse for a long time, and this buggy, it was a really nice horse and buggy, and he was watching it. He makes it down to Coatesville. The state police stop him. And Joe makes the comments that it's harder to get away with this horse theft with all these motor vehicles on the road today. He said, stealing horses ain't what it used to be. Joe was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary for 3 years. He gets out, and the reporters gather around him, and he makes a comment to reporters. He said, of all of us brothers, we spent 158 years in prison between all of us. He said, but none of us were really ever bad. We just got started wrong. In 1942, Joe goes back to prison. He was a patient at the Coatesville Hospital, and he steals another patient's weights on his legs that was needed for traction. And he goes and tries to pawn the metal. He gets arrested, and he's sent back to Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, Joe himself said he hated the newspaper article that reported him saying, I miss home, I'm homesick, I want to go back to Eastern State Penitentiary. He said what he really said was the food was better. They feed you a lot better than in Lancaster County Prison, and he wanted to go back to Eastern State Penitentiary. And he said he was mad because people would always misquote him as saying he was homesick. In 1943, Joe was back out, living here in New Holland with a niece, and he threatens to kill her. And Joe was sent to Lancaster County Prison for 3 weeks. The end of the Buzzard Gang. Now, this is the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. The family's getting older. The brothers are getting older. Jacob, as I said earlier, was the first one to die. He died at Eastern State Penitentiary at the age of 33. And he died of a disease back then it was called consumption, which today is tuberculosis, I believe. That was Abe when he was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary. Oh, I'm getting mixed up here. Okay. This was when he was stealing all the horses. One of the reporters interviewed him, and he said, I'm the best darn horse thief in all of Lancaster County, next to my brother Abe. That's Joe when he was in Eastern State Penitentiary as he got older. There's a booking sheet and his picture. This is in 1941. So Jacob, when he died in Eastern State Penitentiary at the age of 33, they sent him here. They sent his body back to Lancaster County, where he's buried here at the Lancaster Cemetery in what was known as the Commons grounds. There's no headstone. It was for poor people. They couldn't afford it, so they buried him in the common grounds at the Lancaster Cemetery. Martin Buzzard, he dies in 1921 on Redwell Road at his son's house. And he is buried at the Redwell Mennonite Cemetery. Now, there was a Mennonite church on Redwell in the 400 block. It's no longer there, but the small little cemetery is still there. This is Martin Buzzard's death certificate. And he's buried here at the small cemetery on Redwell Road. Ike Buzzard goes blind. And he claims it was when he was shot in the back of the head. Now, I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, it could be, but I'm sure there was more of an eye disease back then that they couldn't treat. But from a young age, around 40, is when he stops committing his crimes. And Ike is sent to the Berks County Almshouse, where he eventually dies in 1930. It is reported that Ike never forgave his brother Martin for pointing the finger at Abe and trying to say that it was Abe that was the one that shot Isaiah Schaefer. Ike died at the Berks County Almshouse, is buried here in Potter Field in Kenhurst. unmarked grave. Abe Buzzard dies in 1935 at Eastern State Penitentiary of cancer. He was sent here to the St. John's Lutheran Church Cemetery in Reading, Pennsylvania. And he was buried here at an unmarked grave that says "at rest." His wife's headstone says "mother." And it was reported that he was buried without anything on his headstone because they were scared about vandals coming there and trying to vandalize it because he had such a big following. John Buzzard, the oldest one, the one that didn't really get into a lot of trouble, he also died in 1940. John died in 1941. He was 95 or 96 years old. And he himself is also buried at the Redwell Mennonite Cemetery. That's the son, John Buzzard, not the father. And Joe Buzzard, he's the last of the living. Joe, after committing those thefts in New Holland, the horse and buggy thefts, and after threatening his niece, he was sent to Lancaster County Prison. When he gets out, Joe's path kind of falls away here. You don't hear much of him, but I found out that he died in a mental institution up in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania called Farview. That is up in Wayne County, Pennsylvania. Where he is buried, it is unknown. I do not know. The legacy of the Buzzard Gang. Now, as I said earlier, the two things that amaze me is one, that they're always known for petty criminals. They were involved in shootouts with the police, shooting people. Isaiah Schaefer got shot in the head. Ellis Bard got shot in the face. Numerous shootouts in Lancaster County. And the legacy of them is why they don't live today, why their legacy didn't live on today. If I said Jesse James, everybody here would know who Jesse James is. You might not know what he did or all his exploits, but you would know his name. If I said Billy the Kid, or if I said the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, everybody here has heard of them. But their legacy lived on. Why did the Buzzard Gang's legacy not live on? I don't know. Abe was reported to have more press in the Lancaster newspaper than anybody at that time except for the President of the United States. When Abe went up to New York City, the whole New York City Police Department was put on alert, given a picture of him and said, look for this guy, he's that infamous or that famous. He had that big of a name back in those days. At one time, Abe's dead or alive warrant was for $1,000, and the county commissioners at one time raised it up to $5,000. Some of your biggest gangs of the Wild West did not have bounties for them for $5,000. Him and his brothers were so popular here in Lancaster County, they were known as the Jesse James of the East Coast. He had dime novels written about him. Abe Buzzard Surrenders. Ike Buzzard had The Criminal Life of Isaac Buzzard. I have a copy of it, one of my most prized possessions. The New York Times wrote about them. The Philadelphia Times wrote about them. Philadelphia Inquirer wrote about them. Of course, the Lancaster Intel, Lancaster Daily News was constantly writing about them. It was reported that this guy here came from England to write about Abe Buzzard. He rented a horse and buggy from New Holland, went out to the Welsh Mountains and was talking to local people, trying to write a story about him. And this was written in the Worldwide magazine from England. When Abe Buzzard dies, there was more than 500 people that attended his funeral. He was that popular of a figure. He was known as the Jesse James of the East Coast. He was talked about constantly. Why their legacy didn't live on, I do not know. I think it's maybe because he mixed petty crimes in with his major crimes when most of the outlaws of the Wild West were involved in a lot of murders and shootouts and didn't really care about stealing, petty things. But why their legacy didn't live on, I do not know. Some older people around this area know about them, but Ike Buzzard, back in the 1880s, was out in Chicago, and he was recognized in Chicago, and he was sent to prison out there. They claimed that 1,000 people showed up at the police station to view Ike Buzzard behind bars because he was that famous. But you talk about them, and not a whole lot of people, know them today. So that ends my speech. I'm sorry about the presentation. I got a little mixed up with this PowerPoint here. I'd like to thank my wife. Could you please stand up and be recognized? Stephanie Zimmerman. She helped me with some of the computer stuff. And my stepdaughter, Amelia Ream. If anybody has any questions, you can.
How do they travel from crime scene to crime scene?
Well, it's kind of funny that you say that because, of course, back then things were a lot slower in life. I assume they traveled mostly on foot or by stealing horses. They'd often be known to steal a horse, ride it to their destination, and they even talked about this, that they'd steal horses. Once they got to their destination, they would let the horse go. And they kind of prided themselves on that, meaning that they didn't steal horses to sell. Because back in those days, stealing horses was a hanging offense. People could get hung for it. Anybody else?
Did they ever actually kill anybody?
They never killed anybody. The closest was Isaiah Schaefer in his house in Groffdale.
Why was he granted pardon?
I don't know. He was always in and out of prison a lot, Maybe the justice system back then was a little different. I don't know. Maybe it's because he talked about becoming a preacher and how he found religion, but then you can see how that didn't really last very long. But anybody else?
As a child in the 40s, I lived up in Montgomery County, and we used to hear all the time about Eastern Buzzards at the Eastern State Penitentiary.
Yep.
Their reputation had
Yep.
extended that far.
Yeah. They were, as I said, they were so popular in this area back then. I'd be willing to bet in the late 1800s, every person in Lancaster County had heard of, or 99% of the people heard of Abe Buzzard, knew who he was, heard of him being this outlaw. Today, very few people know the name. He didn't live on. His legacy didn't live on. Anyone else? The mother, she went on to marry a guy by the name of Daniel Clark, and she had 3 more children. As far as where she is buried, I do not know. I believe she was buried also in the same cemetery up in Mount Airy, what they called Scrufftown. Daniel Clark is buried up there, her second husband, but I don't know. I couldn't find her headstone.
Was she ever in prison again after that initial?
Not that I know of. That was the only article that I ever came upon. And I want to, I should have mentioned this in the beginning. I know a lot about the gang. I can't tell you every single thing about them, but I don't believe she ever was. I think once she married Daniel Clark, that might have given her a little bit more stability, and they owned a store, I was told, up in the Welsh Mountains.
So someone said here that there was a minister murdered up on the mountain.
That wasn't the Buzzards. That happened in around 1930s and 1920s, but it wasn't them, or it wasn't reported then.
I know you gave a lot of information on the Blue Rocks, and I hate to repeat yourself, but can you tell me where that is again without
The Blue Rocks, the best way I could tell you to get there, now it is private land, and I got permission from the owner, but the best way to get to the Blue Rocks or the Blue Cave is come off of, you go up Dean Road, make a left onto Pays Road, go up to the pipeline where the big clear cut is on your left. Walk down the pipeline till right where it starts going down the hill, and it's off to your right. Yep.
They didn't have any children that?
Yeah, they did have children. Abe had a son named Jake, and he had 2 twin daughters. Abe, his son named Jake, committed some crimes when he was younger here in Lancaster County. Jake then went on to have about 10 children of his own. but he moved out to California, where he died out in California. And his children are kind of all over the place, all over the United States. A lot of them still lived here in Lancaster County, but some of his children were in Michigan and also in California. He had a daughter that married and is buried up in the same cemetery as Abe is, and she never had children, but his other daughter moved up to somewhere around Center County, and she had some children. I don't get into the genealogy part of it too much. I'd like to. It's something I might do in the future, but as far as right now, I don't know a whole lot about.
Did the gang just fizzle out after the brothers?
Yeah, when the brothers were gone, the gang kind of fizzled out. Somebody had mentioned if they ever killed, Dottie, you said if they ever killed anybody. Some associates of the gang members did, but the Buzzards themselves did not.
Are Blue Rocks and Money Rocks the same?
No. Money Rocks is in a different part of the Welsh Mountains. And I heard that their name, the way it got the name Money Rocks is because of the legend of Abe, that they would hide money in there, in the rocks, come back for it later. I don't know if that's true. That's what I had heard, but that's at two different locations.
I got a comment. I was born and raised on a poultry farm in Chester County. This time was robbery going on about a poultry farm where this gang got fighting for it.
The-
One time about that, this was probably about 1929, and I wasn't in school yet. And during the daytime, an old black backer drove up the road. The guy who was one man in there, he kept going about 5 miles an hour and took us out. And he drove in a driveway bordering our property at the back. And we watched him the whole time until I got back out. That night, we got robbed. And he cut through the fence. We had wires nailed all over the windows. We tore those up and took off with it.
Yeah.
My father figured he got about 25 young bullets ready to start away.
And do you know how much money they would have been worth back then?
Pardon?
Do you know how much money they would have been worth back then if somebody stole them and went to sell them again?
Do you know how much money they would be worth?
At that time, probably, this is Depression time. It started in, probably worth $4 a piece.
Yeah. So it adds up, I guess.
Can you repeat that story, because we couldn't hear it?
I'm
Can you repeat his story?
I think he said that when he was young, that they had a farm, a chicken farm that was broken into, and a number of chickens or peeps were stolen. And back then, they were going for about $4 a piece. So if people were stealing them and going out and reselling them, they could make a few dollars. Anybody else? Well, you're welcome to come up and look at some of the stuff I have. I certainly appreciate you coming here to hear this tonight. Sorry about the PowerPoint. It was the first time I ever used one. I kind of started getting lost track of my pictures here and what I was talking about. Oh, and one other thing. Oh, they shut it off. So the Buzzards, of course, are lively characters. You had two brothers that died in Eastern State Penitentiary. Abe was a man who claimed to be a preacher who stole. The oldest Buzzard, Martin, numerous times asked for a Civil War pension. Being that he fought in the Civil War himself, he asked for a Civil War pension, and it kept on getting denied. And the reason is that he fought for the North, and after being captured, he switched sides and started fighting for the South. And Joe Buzzard, I wish I had my article up here. Joe Buzzard, the youngest brother, when he got out of prison, he goes up to Reading and starts working at a cigar factory. And he meets a young lady. He starts courting her, and they decide to get married. He tells her his name is Joe Frazier, and he never told her what his real name was until after they were married, when he came out and said, "I'm one of the famous Buzzard brothers." And I assume she eventually divorces him, because you don't hear much of him and his wife after that. So quite a lively crew. Well, thank you for coming, I appreciate it.